It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Princess Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For days, the palace moved as though nothing unusual had happened. Official schedules continued. Public appearances remained carefully managed. Statements were brief, controlled, and deliberately unremarkable. Yet behind those familiar walls, a growing sense of unease had begun spreading through royal circles. According to insiders, a private meeting had been called involving Princess Catherine, Prince William, and several senior advisors whose presence alone was enough to raise questions. These were not routine discussions about engagements, charity work, or ceremonial duties. Something far more significant had brought them together, and the extraordinary secrecy surrounding the meeting only fueled speculation. Those closest to the situation reportedly noticed an immediate change in atmosphere. Palace aides, who were usually willing to offer quiet reassurances, suddenly became guarded. Long-standing staff members avoided questions altogether. Even experienced royal correspondents, accustomed to navigating the carefully controlled world of the monarchy, began hearing the same troubling whispers from multiple directions. Something important had happened. Something serious. Yet no one seemed willing to explain exactly what it was. As rumors spread, attention quickly turned toward Princess Charlotte. At first, many assumed the speculation was exaggerated. After all, Charlotte had long been viewed as one of the most confident and composed young members of the royal family. She represented stability, continuity, and the future. But the more questions emerged, the harder it became to dismiss the concerns entirely. Reports suggested that discussions surrounding Charlotte were not merely about the present. They were about her future role, her responsibilities, and the immense expectations that could one day be placed upon her shoulders. The situation became even more intriguing when observers noticed Catherine leaving the private gathering. Those who saw her afterward described a woman carrying an emotional weight she could not completely hide. For years, Catherine had mastered the difficult balance between public duty and private emotion. Yet on this occasion, according to those familiar with the atmosphere, there was a visible seriousness that immediately caught attention. It was not panic. It was not confusion. It was something deeper. Something that suggested difficult truths had been discussed behind closed doors. Later that same evening, another moment quietly added fuel to the growing mystery. William was reportedly seen spending private time with Charlotte, offering reassurance and support. While such interactions between father and daughter were hardly unusual, the timing was impossible to ignore. Royal insiders who had already been sensing tension for weeks began connecting the dots. Some would later claim that subtle signs had been present for far longer than anyone realized. Conversations had changed. Certain topics had become increasingly sensitive. Questions about the monarchy's future were being asked more frequently in private than in public. Then came the development that transformed concern into genuine intrigue. Sources close to royal circles began linking the entire situation to conversations that stretched back years, to discussions held during the final chapter of Queen Elizabeth's life. Suddenly, what seemed like a modern royal issue appeared connected to something much older, something unfinished. Questions emerged about private warnings, hidden concerns, and conversations that had never been intended for public ears. And at the center of those questions stood one figure whose silence had become impossible to ignore: Princess Anne. Unlike many members of the royal family, Anne had built a reputation for duty above emotion, service above attention, and loyalty above personal ambition. If she knew something, she would protect it. If she had been entrusted with a responsibility, she would carry it without complaint. Yet whispers now suggested that Anne possessed knowledge reaching back to Queen Elizabeth's final days. Knowledge that might explain why Charlotte's future had suddenly become the subject of such extraordinary concern. Knowledge that could reshape how the public understood the late Queen's final wishes. As speculation intensified, one possibility began to overshadow all others. What if the concerns surrounding Charlotte were not new at all? What if they were connected to a plan, a warning, or a responsibility that had been quietly passed down years earlier? And if that was true, why was the issue resurfacing now, at a moment when the monarchy faced increasing uncertainty and profound change? But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried, until now. Years before the current crisis, Queen Elizabeth reportedly held one final series of deeply private conversations with the person she trusted more than almost anyone else in the family, Princess Anne. As questions surrounding Charlotte continued to spread through royal circles, attention increasingly shifted away from the future and toward the past. More specifically, toward the final months of Queen Elizabeth's life. Those were months marked not only by declining health but also by reflection, concern, and an awareness that the institution she had devoted herself to for more than 70 years would soon pass into unfamiliar hands. Publicly, the Queen remained a symbol of steadiness. Privately, according to royal insiders, she was thinking deeply about what would happen after she was gone. And in those moments of quiet reflection, one name appeared again and again beside her own: Princess Anne. For decades, Anne had occupied a unique place within the royal family. She was never the loudest voice, never the most celebrated figure, and never the one seeking attention. Yet she had earned something far more valuable than headlines. She had earned trust. While others navigated public expectations and shifting relationships, Anne remained constant, reliable, unwavering, loyal to duty above all else. It was precisely those qualities, many believe, that brought her closer to the Queen during the monarch's final chapter than almost anyone realized. Reports suggest that as the Queen's health gradually weakened, the frequency of her private conversations with Anne increased noticeably. Palace staff allegedly observed meetings that seemed different from ordinary family discussions. These were not brief exchanges about schedules or ceremonial matters. They were longer, more deliberate, more personal. Doors remained closed. Details remained protected. And when those meetings ended, neither woman offered even the smallest hint of what had been discussed. The secrecy surrounding those conversations only fueled speculation. Some insiders would later claim that the Queen had become increasingly concerned about the future stability of the monarchy, not because she doubted its strength, but because she understood better than anyone how fragile public trust could become. She had witnessed crises, scandals, and moments when the institution itself appeared vulnerable. She knew that preserving the crown required more than tradition. It required discipline, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to duty. According to those familiar with royal affairs, the Queen's concerns extended beyond the immediate future. She was thinking about generations yet to come, about William, about Catherine, about George, Charlotte, and Louis. Most importantly, she was thinking about the values that would guide them when difficult choices inevitably arrived: loyalty, responsibility, service, principles she believed had protected the monarchy through decades of turbulence. Principles she reportedly feared could be weakened if future generations lost sight of their purpose. As these conversations continued, Anne allegedly became more than a trusted listener. She became a guardian of knowledge, a keeper of concerns that were never intended for public debate. The burden of such responsibility was enormous. Every word carried weight. Every warning carried consequences. If the Queen truly shared her deepest worries during those final months, Anne understood that revealing them prematurely could create exactly the kind of instability the Queen wished to avoid. Yet even as Anne protected those conversations, subtle signs began appearing. Small developments inside the family, growing tensions, unexpected challenges. None seemed significant on their own, but together they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. It was as though pieces of a puzzle the Queen had quietly described were beginning to fall into place one by one. What made the situation even more unsettling was the timing. Years after those private meetings ended, circumstances began unfolding that appeared eerily connected to the warnings Anne was believed to have received. Questions about succession, responsibility, public expectations, and the role of the younger generation suddenly carried new meaning. The whispers that had once sounded like distant concerns no longer felt distant at all. For Anne, the realization was likely both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. The woman who had spent her life protecting the institution now found herself carrying memories of conversations that seemed more relevant with every passing year. Conversations that may have contained warnings no one fully understood at the time. Conversations that now appeared connected to the uncertainty surrounding Charlotte and the future of the monarchy itself. And as those connections became harder to dismiss, Anne reportedly found herself revisiting every word, every concern, and every lesson shared during those final private moments with the Queen. Because what once seemed like cautious reflection was beginning to look like something else entirely, a carefully considered attempt to prepare the monarchy for challenges that had not yet arrived. As Anne carried those conversations into the years that followed, she began noticing signs that the Queen's fears were becoming reality. At first, the warnings seemed vague, but with every passing year, events inside the royal family appeared to echo the concerns Queen Elizabeth had quietly shared. The more Anne reflected on those final conversations, the harder it became to dismiss the uncomfortable parallels emerging around her. What once sounded like cautious observations from an aging monarch increasingly felt like carefully delivered warnings. Not predictions in the dramatic sense, but concerns rooted in decades of experience. Queen Elizabeth had spent a lifetime watching the monarchy endure moments of triumph and periods of turmoil. She understood that threats to the institution rarely arrived all at once. They appeared gradually, often disguised as temporary problems, personal disagreements, or isolated controversies. Yet over time, those small cracks could become dangerous fractures. And according to those familiar with the situation, Anne was beginning to see those fractures appear. The years following the Queen's passing were marked by significant change. New responsibilities emerged. Expectations grew heavier. Public scrutiny intensified. For Prince William and Princess Catherine, the pressure was relentless. They were no longer simply preparing for the future. In many ways, they had become the future. Every decision carried greater weight. Every challenge seemed larger than before. Behind the scenes, they were navigating responsibilities that stretched far beyond public appearances and ceremonial obligations. They were carrying the burden of maintaining stability during one of the most uncertain periods the modern monarchy had faced in decades. As that pressure increased, divisions within the wider family appeared to deepen. Long-standing tensions that had once been managed quietly now seemed impossible to ignore. Relationships became more complicated. Public disagreements attracted global attention. Every controversy generated new questions about unity, trust, and the institution's long-term strength. For Anne, these developments reportedly felt unsettlingly familiar. The concerns she had once heard expressed in private discussions with the Queen appeared to be resurfacing in real time. Yet what troubled her most was not the conflict itself. Royal families had survived disagreements before. They had endured scandals, criticism, and periods of instability throughout history. What concerned Anne was the growing impact these struggles were having on public confidence. The monarchy's strength had always depended on something larger than individual personalities. It relied on trust, the belief that those entrusted with royal duty would place service above personal interest. If that trust weakened, the consequences could reach far beyond any single disagreement. Within this changing landscape, attention increasingly turned toward the younger generation. George represented the future king. Louis brought energy and unpredictability. But Charlotte occupied a particularly unique position. She stood at the intersection of tradition and change. She carried enormous symbolic importance, not simply because of her place within the line of succession, but because she represented the next chapter of a monarchy striving to remain relevant while preserving centuries of history. According to insiders, this was precisely why discussions involving Charlotte carried such significance. Her future was not merely a family matter. It was connected to broader questions about the institution itself. As these pressures intensified, Anne reportedly adopted the role she had always embraced best: observer, protector, and guardian. She did not seek attention. She did not make public declarations. Instead, she watched. She listened. She measured developments against the conversations she remembered so clearly. And with each passing year, the similarities became more difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, palace insiders quietly began noticing the same connections. Individuals familiar with both past discussions and present events allegedly started drawing comparisons between the Queen's concerns and the challenges now unfolding. What had once seemed like isolated incidents increasingly appeared connected by a larger pattern. A pattern involving duty, responsibility, succession, and the preservation of values the Queen believed were essential to the monarchy's survival. The realization was deeply unsettling. If the Queen had indeed anticipated many of these difficulties, then Anne was carrying knowledge far more significant than anyone outside the palace understood. Knowledge that could explain why certain conversations remained protected. Knowledge that could clarify why Charlotte's future had suddenly become a matter of extraordinary concern. And most importantly, knowledge that might reveal the true purpose behind the Queen's final private warnings. For years, Anne remained committed to silence. She honored the trust that had been placed in her. But as familiar patterns continued emerging and old concerns transformed into present realities, Maintaining that silence became increasingly difficult, because somewhere amid the growing uncertainty, a development reportedly emerged that changed everything. A discovery so unexpected and so significant that it forced Anne to reconsider whether keeping the Queen's secrets was still protecting the monarchy, or preventing it from understanding the danger ahead. Then came a discovery that reportedly convinced Anne the time for silence was ending. For years, Anne remained loyal to the Queen's wishes. But one revelation changed everything and forced her to reconsider how much longer she could stay silent. The burden of a secret often grows heavier with time. What begins as a promise eventually becomes a responsibility, and responsibility can become a test. For Princess Anne, that test reportedly arrived years after Queen Elizabeth's passing, when circumstances inside the monarchy began aligning too closely with concerns she had spent so long protecting. She had remained steadfast. She had honored the confidence placed in her. While rumors swirled and speculation intensified, Anne refused to be drawn into public discussions. She understood the value of discretion better than almost anyone. Yet, even the strongest commitment to silence can be shaken when new information emerges, and according to royal insiders, that is exactly what happened. Reports suggest that a collection of private materials connected to the late Queen unexpectedly resurfaced during a routine review of royal records. The exact nature of these materials remains the subject of intense speculation. Some claim they involve personal correspondence. Others point toward memoranda, notes, or reflections prepared during the Queen's final years. Whatever their form, those familiar with the matter allegedly agree on one thing. The contents carried enormous significance. They were not merely historical documents. They appeared to address concerns about the monarchy's future, concerns that now seemed remarkably relevant. For Anne, the discovery reportedly triggered a wave of emotions she had spent years keeping under control. The Queen's voice, preserved through those private records, seemed to reach across time. Every warning felt sharper, every concern felt more urgent. What had once been theoretical possibilities now appeared connected to real events unfolding around the royal family. The realization was both powerful and deeply unsettling, because if the Queen had anticipated these challenges, then ignoring those warnings could carry consequences far greater than anyone imagined. At the center of Anne's struggle was a painful question. Did loyalty to the Queen require continued silence, or did loyalty to the monarchy require action? The two had always seemed inseparable. Now they appeared to be moving in opposite directions. Protecting private conversations had been simple when the issues remained distant. But with tensions growing and uncertainty spreading, remaining silent began to feel less like protection and more like risk. The situation became even more complicated as concerns spread among senior members of the royal family. Discussions that had once been confined to a small circle reportedly expanded. Trusted advisors became involved. Sensitive conversations took place behind closed doors. Questions were raised about succession, stability, and the responsibilities waiting for the next generation. According to insiders, it was during this period that William and Catherine were quietly brought into discussions surrounding the Queen's final concerns. For both of them, the information was said to be profoundly unsettling. They had already been carrying enormous pressure as the future of the monarchy. Yet these conversations suggested that certain challenges had been anticipated years earlier. More importantly, they hinted that the Queen's concerns extended beyond immediate issues and toward the long-term survival of values she believed were essential to the crown. Then came the most unexpected development of all. As pieces of the puzzle gradually came together, Charlotte's connection to the matter reportedly became impossible to ignore. What initially appeared to be a discussion about the monarchy's future suddenly became intertwined with her role within it, not because of any action she had taken, but because of what she represented. According to those familiar with the discussions, Charlotte embodied many of the qualities the Queen believed future generations would need: duty, resilience, stability, characteristics that now carried greater significance than ever before. The deeper the conversations went, the more urgent they became. Senior royals allegedly recognized that they were no longer dealing with isolated concerns. They were confronting questions that could influence the institution for decades. Every revelation seemed connected to another. Every answer created new uncertainties. And standing at the center of it all was Anne, carrying knowledge that had remained hidden for years. The pressure continued building until silence itself became difficult to defend. What began as private reflection evolved into something much larger. The Queen's concerns no longer belonged solely to the past. They had become part of the present. And as William and Catherine absorbed the full weight of what Anne had uncovered, it became increasingly clear that the monarchy was approaching a turning point no one had anticipated. And when William finally learned what Anne knew, the implications reached far beyond the present moment. The future king had spent years preparing for responsibility, but nothing could have prepared him for the message Anne reportedly carried from the late queen. By the time William was finally brought into the heart of the discussions, the situation had evolved far beyond private concern. What began as scattered questions about the future had transformed into something much larger, something rooted in the final thoughts of a monarch who had spent a lifetime safeguarding the crown. For years, William had been preparing for the role he would one day inherit. He had studied duty, embraced responsibility, and accepted the sacrifices that came with being the future king. Yet, according to royal insiders, none of that preparation could fully shield him from the weight of what Anne was about to share. Reports suggest that the conversation was unlike any William had experienced before. Anne was not speaking as a senior royal or as a trusted advisor. She was speaking as the keeper of Queen Elizabeth's final concerns. The information she carried had remained protected for years, not because it lacked importance, but because of how significant it truly was. Every word reportedly traced back to the late queen's fears, hopes, and expectations for the generations that would follow her. As Anne revealed what she knew, the atmosphere surrounding the discussions allegedly shifted. Questions that had once seemed theoretical suddenly became personal. Challenges that appeared distant suddenly felt immediate. William was no longer hearing abstract concerns about the monarchy's future. He was confronting the possibility the queen had spent her final years quietly preparing for difficulties she believed were inevitable. Those close to the family suggest that the emotional impact was profound. Senior royals who became aware of the conversations reportedly found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. The Queen's message was not one of despair. It was a warning wrapped in hope. She believed the monarchy could endure. She believed future generations were capable of preserving it. But she also understood that survival would require sacrifice. Duty would need to come before comfort. Responsibility would need to outweigh personal desires. And difficult decisions would need to be made, even when they carried emotional costs. For William, those lessons were hardly new. He had spent his entire life hearing variations of them. Yet hearing them through the lens of the Queen's final reflections gave them a different meaning. This was not simply institutional advice. It was the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had carried the crown through decades of change. The realization reportedly forced him to reflect not only on his future role as king, but also on the legacy he hoped to leave behind. At the same time, Catherine's role within these discussions became increasingly important. According to insiders, she understood immediately that the issues being raised extended beyond royal protocol or constitutional responsibility. They touched the very heart of family. As a mother, her concern naturally centered on her children. As a future queen, her concern extended to the stability of the institution itself. The two responsibilities were becoming impossible to separate. This growing sense of urgency reportedly strengthened Catherine's determination. If the Queen's concerns truly involved the future generations of the monarchy, then protecting her family meant protecting something much larger than herself. It meant ensuring that the values the Queen cherished would continue long after those who remembered her personally were gone. The burden was immense, but so was the resolve it inspired. Within that larger picture, Charlotte's significance continued to grow. What had initially appeared to be a peripheral connection now seemed central to many of the concerns being discussed. Insiders began suggesting that Charlotte represented a unique bridge between the monarchy's traditions and its future evolution. Her role was no longer viewed solely through the lens of succession. Instead, she increasingly became part of a broader conversation about character, leadership, and the preservation of royal values. As William absorbed the information Anne had shared, the implications reportedly stretched far beyond immediate concerns. The Queen's message was not only about the present generation. It was about those who would come after them. It was about safeguarding principles that could not be inherited automatically. They had to be taught, protected, and lived. Yet even as William and Catherine struggled to process the magnitude of what they were learning, Anne reportedly understood that they had only uncovered part of the story. The revelations already seemed extraordinary. They appeared to explain years of secrecy, concern, and careful observation. But according to those closest to the matter, one critical piece remained hidden. One final element connected everything together and transformed the Queen's concerns into something even more: Astonishing. Yet the most shocking part of the Queen's message had still not been revealed. According to royal insiders, Anne made a promise during the Queen's final days, a promise she intended to keep no matter the cost. As William and Catherine struggled to absorb the significance of everything Anne had revealed, the story reached even deeper into the past. Because behind the warnings, the private records, and the years of silence, there was something more personal. Something that explained why Anne had carried this burden for so long. According to those familiar with the late Queen's final months, the foundation of everything rested on a promise, one made during a period of profound uncertainty, when Queen Elizabeth understood that her time was growing short, and the future of the monarchy would soon rest in the hands of others. The circumstances surrounding those final days were emotionally overwhelming for everyone closest to her. For decades, the Queen had been a symbol of continuity. She had guided the institution through political change, family crises, public scrutiny, and historic transitions. To imagine a monarchy without her seemed almost impossible. Yet as her health declined, those nearest to her reportedly began confronting a reality they had long hoped to avoid. The era she had defined was coming to an end. Among those who remained closest during that difficult period was Princess Anne. Their relationship had always been built on mutual respect, honesty, and an unwavering understanding of duty. Unlike many others, Anne never needed explanations about the demands of royal life. She understood sacrifice because she had lived it herself. She understood responsibility because she had carried it for decades. That shared understanding reportedly made her one of the few people the Queen trusted to discuss her deepest concerns without reservation. According to insiders, it was during one of those final conversations that Anne received responsibility unlike any she had ever carried before. The Queen's concerns were not centered on herself. Even in her final chapter, her focus reportedly remained fixed on the institution she had spent her life protecting. She worried about the challenges future generations would face. She thought about William and the immense burden waiting for him. She thought about Catherine and the strength she would need as a future queen. She thought about George, Charlotte, and Louis, whose lives would be shaped by responsibilities they could not yet fully understand. Most of all, the Queen reportedly hoped they would remain guided by principles rather than pressure, duty rather than popularity, service rather than self-interest. Those values had sustained the monarchy through its most difficult moments, and she believed they would be needed again in the years ahead. According to those familiar with the discussions, Anne listened carefully as the Queen spoke about the future, fully aware that these were not ordinary reflections. They were the thoughts of a monarch trying to ensure that the institution would remain strong long after she was gone. What followed, insiders claim, was a promise, a commitment from Anne that she would do everything within her power to protect those values and safeguard the future the Queen envisioned. It was not a promise built on ambition or authority. It was built on loyalty. Anne reportedly understood that honoring the Queen's wishes might require patience, restraint, and silence. She accepted that burden willingly. Yet keeping such a promise came at a cost. As the years passed and circumstances changed, Anne allegedly found herself carrying knowledge she could not easily share. She watched events unfold. She witnessed growing tensions. She observed challenges facing William and Catherine. Time and again, she resisted the temptation to speak publicly. Every concern she carried was weighed against the commitment she had made. Every decision was filtered through the promise she intended to honor. That silence was not easy. It required Anne to place duty above personal feelings, just as she always had. While others speculated, she remained quiet. While questions multiplied, she remained disciplined. The contrast was striking. The world demanded answers, yet Anne remained focused on protecting the trust that had been placed in her. But the significance of that promise became impossible to ignore as the monarchy entered a new era of uncertainty. The warnings Anne carried no longer belonged solely to the past. They had become relevant to the present. The future generations the Queen worried about were now growing into their roles. The challenges she feared were beginning to emerge, and the responsibility Anne had accepted years earlier was becoming heavier with every passing day. For a long time, honoring the promise meant staying silent. Now, however, the very act of keeping that promise seemed to be leading Anne toward a difficult crossroads. Because the closer she came to fulfilling the Queen's wishes, the more she realized that silence alone might no longer be enough. But promises have consequences, and Anne was about to face hers. When Anne finally decided to speak, even partially, the reaction inside royal circles was immediate and explosive. For years, questions had lingered in the background of royal life, unanswered and carefully avoided. Rumors surfaced and disappeared. Speculation rose and fell. Yet the one person who seemed capable of confirming or denying the countless theories surrounding Queen Elizabeth's final concerns remained silent. That silence had become part of the mystery itself. Which is why the moment Anne finally chose to share even a portion of what she knew, the impact was far greater than anyone expected. According to royal insiders, the information Anne disclosed did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It emerged gradually through private discussions, carefully controlled conversations, and a growing willingness to acknowledge concerns that had previously remained locked away. Yet despite that caution, the effect was immediate. Senior royals reportedly found themselves confronting truths they had never fully understood. Pieces of the puzzle that had remained scattered for years suddenly began fitting together. What made the revelation so powerful was not merely the information itself, it was the source. Anne had built her reputation on restraint. She was not known for exaggeration or emotional declarations. She was known for discipline, discretion, and unwavering loyalty. If she believed something was important enough to discuss, others listened. And according to those familiar with the situation, what Anne revealed forced many within royal circles to reconsider how they viewed the Queen's final years. Almost overnight, attention shifted back toward Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Not the public legacy recorded in history books, but the private legacy she left behind for her family. The conversations she had held, the concerns she had expressed, the hopes she had quietly carried for the generations who would follow her. Suddenly, discussions that had once focused on present-day challenges became connected to a much larger story. A story stretching back to the final months of a monarch whose influence seemed to extend far beyond her lifetime. As these revelations circulated, another name continued appearing at the center of the conversation: Charlotte. What had initially seemed like an isolated concern involving her future role now appeared linked to broader questions about the monarchy's direction. According to insiders, the more Anne shared, the clearer it became that Charlotte represented something larger than her position within the family. She symbolized continuity, stability, the future the Queen had spent so much time contemplating during her final years. That growing connection intensified public curiosity. Royal observers began searching for clues in past events. Commentators revisited earlier reports. Every appearance, every statement, and every rumor suddenly attracted renewed attention. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Had the Queen seen challenges approaching long before others recognized them? Had Anne spent years protecting information she believed the public was never meant to hear? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly had the Queen hoped future generations would learn from her warnings? The speculation quickly spread beyond palace walls. Media interest surged as analysts and royal correspondents attempted to understand the significance of what was unfolding. Some focused on succession. Others focused on family dynamics. But beneath every theory was the same central question: why now? Why had Anne decided that this was the moment to reveal even part of the truth? Meanwhile, William and Catherine reportedly recognized that the situation could no longer be treated as a private matter. The issues being discussed had implications reaching far beyond personal relationships. They touched the future of the institution itself. According to insiders, the couple responded by becoming increasingly involved in conversations surrounding the Queen's wishes and the responsibilities attached to them. What began as concern gradually evolved into action. They understood that preserving the monarchy required more than honoring the past. It required preparing for what came next. Throughout it all, Anne's role became clearer than ever before. She was no longer simply the Queen's daughter. She had become the guardian of her final wishes, the protector of concerns entrusted to her years earlier. Every decision she made reflected the promise she had carried for so long. Yet even as she stepped into that role more openly, there remained a sense that the full story had not yet emerged. Because despite everything that had been revealed, despite the questions answered and the mysteries clarified, insiders continued insisting that one final piece remained hidden. One revelation still sat at the center of the entire story. A revelation capable of changing how everything else was understood. And as attention intensified around Anne, William, Catherine, and Charlotte, that final secret loomed larger than ever. As the dust began to settle, one final revelation remained. In the end, this was never simply about secrets. It was about a monarch's final attempt to protect the institution she spent her entire life serving. As the final pieces of the story came together, a clearer picture began to emerge. The warnings, the private conversations, the years of silence, the emotional burden carried by Anne. None of it existed for the sake of mystery alone. At the heart of everything was a single purpose: protecting the future of the monarchy. According to those closest to the unfolding events, Queen Elizabeth's final message was never intended to create fear or division. It was intended to prepare those she trusted for challenges she believed would eventually arrive. The true significance of her words was not about what could be lost. It was about what still needed to be preserved. For decades, Queen Elizabeth embodied stability during moments of uncertainty. She witnessed dramatic changes in society, politics, culture, and public expectations. Through triumphs and controversies alike, she remained guided by a simple belief that the monarchy could survive almost anything if it remained anchored to duty and service. According to insiders, that belief formed the foundation of the message she entrusted to Anne. The Queen understood that titles, ceremonies, and traditions mattered, but she believed the real strength of the crown came from something deeper. It came from character, from responsibility, from the willingness to place the institution above personal interests when difficult choices had to be made. That understanding explains why Anne's role became so important. For years, she served as the keeper of a trust few people fully understood. She protected conversations that could have easily become headlines. She carried concerns that might have fueled endless speculation. She remained silent not because the information lacked importance, but because she believed honoring the Queen's wishes required patience. In many ways, Anne became the bridge between one era and the next. While others focused on immediate challenges, she remained focused on the larger purpose behind everything the Queen had shared with her. As these truths gradually surfaced, William and Catherine found themselves stepping into an even greater sense of responsibility. Their roles were no longer defined simply by what they would inherit. They were defined by what they would protect. The lessons passed down from the Queen through Anne became more than family history. They became a guide for navigating the future. According to royal insiders, both William and Catherine recognized that preserving the monarchy would require strength, unity, and an unwavering commitment to the values that had sustained it for generations. At the center of that future stood Charlotte. Throughout this story, her name had appeared repeatedly, sometimes quietly, and sometimes at the center of growing concern. Yet her importance was never solely about succession or public expectations. She came to symbolize something larger. She represented continuity, a reminder that every generation inherits not only privileges, but also responsibilities. According to those familiar with the Queen's thinking, the future of the monarchy would depend on young royals understanding that service is not a burden to avoid but a duty to embrace. That idea ultimately became the heart of the Queen's final message: duty, service, sacrifice. These were not merely words repeated during public ceremonies. They were principles that shaped lives. They demanded difficult choices. They required personal compromises. And they often asked individuals to place something greater than themselves first. The contrast is striking. Success brings admiration, recognition, and influence. Duty often demands restraint, discipline, and sacrifice. Yet throughout her life, Queen Elizabeth consistently chose the latter, believing that true leadership required it. Even after her passing, her influence continues to shape the monarchy. The conversations she held, the lessons she shared, and the concerns she expressed remain deeply relevant. According to those closest to the family, her presence is still felt not through public declarations, but through the decisions being made by those she prepared to carry the crown forward. In that sense, her legacy is not confined to history. It continues living through the choices of the next generation. The future of the House of Windsor remains unwritten. New challenges will emerge. Public expectations will continue evolving. Difficult decisions will inevitably arise. Yet if this story reveals anything, it is that the monarchy's greatest strength has never been its buildings, titles, or ceremonies. Its strength has always come from the people willing to protect it, even when doing so demands sacrifice. And as Princess Anne finally stepped out from the shadow of that final promise, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Queen may be gone, but the path she laid out for the future of the monarchy is only now beginning to unfold. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.